Hello, my name is Anna, and I make video essays about advertising, history, and culture. Where this video lies, I do not know yet, but let's see where it goes. So, I have been getting recommended to me a lot of videos about cave diving deaths and disasters. And it's not surprising to find that there were hundreds of videos like that. I think it's because human beings have this tendency to look at this content maybe to feel more secure in their own lives and actions, and also because it draws them in a horror story or creepypasta kind of way. Cave diving is known as an extreme sport, but it also yields valuable scientific information about sources of water and the formation of rocks. Underwater caves tell us about the Earth's evolution, and often are the sites of fossils and formations thousands of years old. Cave divers have discovered underground connections between water sources and previously unknown species of animals. There are also no other ways of entering and exploring many of the world's underwater caves without gearing up and diving in. We also find out more about the movement of tectonic plates and how species of animals within these caves relate back to prehistoric origins and to other parts of the world entirely. The whole world continues to learn from cave divers. But cave diving is still generally known as unnecessary thrill-seeking by the general public. Beyond the appeal of looking at the train wreck as you're passing by, there is also the thought that learning more about these disasters can help us avoid them in the future. At least this is the case for Jill Heinerth, who is an extremely famous cave diver who is also a world-renowned photographer, underwater photographer, and technical diver. Jill was one of a few women cave divers when she first began, and is still one of a few women who are professional technical divers. This is definitely a male-dominated field, and it has had a lot of sexist preconceived notions that have limited women from participating in the sport and participating in more research contributions. This often led to uncomfortable dive environments, and when people like Jill had to trust her life and safety to her partners on dive teams, there were times when she was entrusting her life to people that did not necessarily have her best interest in mind. Cave diving and diving is a lot about trust, right? Trust in your equipment and your abilities, and also the abilities of others, the people that you're with. Anyone who already dives knows that an open water certification is required for you to begin scuba diving on your own. And after that, if you want to get into cave diving, that is a whole other set of courses and equipment. A cave diving certification is also a requirement if you want to dive within Florida caves. I live in Florida, and I found out that Florida is one of the premier locations for cave diving because of the environment, the warm water, the shipwrecks, and the caves, which is pretty cool. It's not something that I ever knew about because I am not a diver, or a caver, or a cave diver. But Florida caves attract divers from all over the world. Before cave diving was a sport with certifications and standards, it was a little bit more of a free-for-all, definitely more accessible, and it wasn't until the 1970s when Shek Exley, an extremely well-known cave diver, created a book on the basics of cave diving. Definitely this was something that was needed, there were not books like it before, but that didn't mean that this magically prevented cave diving disasters, right? There were still, especially in Florida, cave diving deaths. And that's just because it is more complicated than diving itself, right? You might be asking, why? So, when you're in open water and you're not going past 70 feet in depth, you can actually ascend back to the surface fairly quickly. You don't have to worry about decompression stops. And again, you can just go up if you decide it's time to go. Meanwhile, when you're in a cave, the ceiling prevents you from going right back up, and that knowledge, while you may understand that here on land, underwater it can induce panic in a lot of divers. So Shek Exley is a super famous cave diver who died in the Zacaton cenote when he was attempting to break a world record, his own record actually, of diving to 1,000 feet. Unless you're diving in a cavern that's pretty big and a lot of open walls, you're not necessarily touching spaces or in tight restrictions, caves require different equipment, and that includes smaller tanks, side-mounted tanks, and buoyancy control devices. Now, beyond 70 and 100 feet, the very real danger of nitrogen narcosis presents itself. And the only way to prevent something like that beyond not going deeper is to carry with you tanks that include oxygen mixes. So you don't just bring oxygen in those tanks. Now you mix with nitrogen, which is called nitrox, or nitrogen, helium, and oxygen, which is a trimix. There are dive shops that help with the kind of calculation of the mixture of gases, and some online resources as well. But again, it's another complication that you have to add to your diving repertoire, to your skills. So the effects of nitrogen narcosis can vary from person to person, and the onset can as well. So somebody that feels totally fine at 70, 80, 90 feet can definitely start to feel it at 100, 120, etc. And then there are people that won't feel it until maybe like 150 feet. And it really just depends on your own biology. We still don't necessarily understand why, but what happens as you go deeper into the ocean is a buildup of nitrogen in your blood. And the reason why you have to ascend very slowly, even if your descent was 10, 20 minutes, is because when that nitrogen builds up in your blood, going up too fast will create bubbles. And those bubbles can get lodged in your spine, in your brain, can cause heart attacks, right? They can clog your arteries. If you do happen to get decompression sickness or the bends, there are decompression chambers that can help lower the symptoms and get you healthy again. So you may leave without permanent damage. You may not. Nitrogen narcosis symptoms include feeling really drunk and joint pain, hallucinations, confusion, things that you don't want to be feeling underwater. Cave divers in Florida would also use gas mixes because caves in Florida can be as deep as 400 feet. Now, I mentioned divers a lot, but there are also dry cavers, and dry cavers do become cave divers as well. And something that cavers are familiar with that they train for before entering a smaller cave are restrictions. Now, restrictions are little tiny gap spaces where you kind of have to press your body between walls and kind of nudge your way through, shimmy in there, which to me sounds terrifying. There's also a training where they put you between two planks of wood and tighten them, so you have to see how you would react, how you would feel in that kind of state. For people that have claustrophobia, it's probably not fun at all. But training for every possible scenario is very important in caving, diving, and especially cave diving. Now, those kinds of restrictions that you find in dry caves, you will also find in underwater caves, and they are, of course, extremely dangerous because while getting stuck in a dry cave is not fun and not safe, getting stuck in an underwater cave kind of makes the time limit that you have under there just a lot. It goes by a lot faster, and there have been people who've died because they've gone in restrictions and gotten stuck and weren't able to get help in time. So that's another thing. The deeper you go, the more intense you go caving, diving, cave diving, the harder it is for a search and rescue team to help you. Now, I'm going to be dead honest with you. I don't personally feel like I could sandwich myself between two boards to even train for something like this. And I've never even been scuba diving because I'm afraid of the ocean. I will say that. It's just looking underwater, those, seeing sea animals, sea life. It's I'm sure it's really cool. And I've been acclimating myself with some videos of underwater, but it's scary to me. It's like outer space, but with animals, right? I feel like I'd be more comfortable in outer space because I wouldn't run into an animal that I have no idea how to interact with. I'm just kind of frozen in fear. So that, what can you say? Did you know that you only have to be 10 years old to take a scuba diving certification course, though? When I learned that, I was like, wow, there's some brave 10-year-olds out there, braver than me. You know what, if I had been given some kind of scuba diving certification at 10, if I were just kind of thrown in those classes, maybe I would be diving right now. Who knows? Whatever. I'm just recognizing my limits here. It is a little frustrating knowing that I'm holding myself back. But I also know that you don't go from zero to cave diver, and I wouldn't want to either. But I did go to a dry cave here. I did go to a dry cave here in Florida just to check it out and kind of see what I'm talking about in a first-hand experience instead of the second-hand. Expeditions previously thought impossible, like going into an iceberg, have been made possible by cave divers like Jill Heinerth, whose book Into the Planet describes how she literally dove into an iceberg in Antarctica. And it was scary. Like, just her descriptions of it are terrifying. The ice cold water that is a different experience than diving somewhere like Florida or Mexico. Jill Heinerth has also made extreme strides in the way that we're able to explore underwater, like with the Sunfish Device, which actually creates 3D maps of underwater caves by scanning them, I think with sonar. I was able to speak with two friends of mine who happen to be cave divers, and they were kind enough to let me ask them a few questions about what they love about cave diving, what's difficult about it, and the community that they've met here in Florida. They've both been cave diving for over 6 years now. Now, my friends' names are Mike and Natalie. They both described underwater caves like alien worlds right below our feet. Mike finds that cavers, in Florida at least, are a welcoming bunch, and they'll take any experience level. However, he's found that cave divers are actually not known for being as nice. He specifically said that with cave diving, the barrier to entry is a little higher, so they're also a little more elitist. I then asked him how much of that attitude does he believe comes from an abundance of caution. And he said that it would be about 10% abundance of caution and 90% ego in his opinion. Natalie says that you get a lot of military-type personalities in cave diving, and not very warm types. A do it my way or you die kind of thing. And maybe that's where the not-so-nice reputation comes from with cave divers. Then I specifically asked Natalie about what being a woman in cave diving was like, considering that they are the minority in cave diving. She noted that all of the women that she's spoken to and that she has dived with have been very kind, and kinder than the men for the most part, but that's only been about 5 women in total. There was an emphasis on the community in cave diving. And Mike mentioned that what makes a dive meaningful, what makes a really good dive, is when there's a lot of team rapport. And it really makes you realize that cave diving is a team sport. They also described underwater caves as large as subway passages or rooms in parts of Devil's Den where the water is very clear, but the light doesn't touch the walls, so you look like you're floating in outer space. And maybe counterintuitive, but honestly you have to be very calm when you're doing something like cave diving, which, yes, is described as an extreme sport. But Natalie describes it like this: it can be super calming once you get down. The barrier to entry is so expensive, but in doing that, you know your gear really well and you have training where you prepare for stuff going wrong. It's also very quiet. You're weightless, the water's kind of cool. It's like an alien world. You're just like floating through passages, kind of seeing all the interesting geology. And a lot of times in Florida caves, there are fossils, which are really cool to see. Then we got into more of the technical aspects of cave diving, and I started asking how deep they usually go on their dives. And Mike said that most cave divers aren't actually diving to depths like 400 feet, right, like the deepest of Florida caves. That's more like extreme explorers. They usually stay in the 60 to 100 foot range. Now, deep diving is one of the riskiest parts of the sport. The risks multiply as you go deeper for a number of reasons, physiologically and gear-wise, when you get deeper than 100 feet. 100 feet is like the thresholds for when things get really complicated in diving. I then asked how many dives it took for them to feel comfortable in an underwater cave. Natalie responded, "At the end of my class, I was pretty comfortable. Ideally, at the end of your course, you feel comfortable. You do a good amount of dives. Your dive partner is also a big thing. You have to trust them. There can be people you can trust when something goes wrong, and then there are some people I've met where I'm like, I don't want to dive with you ever again." Mike says that you build a risk profile and naturally filter out people who don't meet that risk profile. With any sport, you're assuming a certain amount of risk, and that can be as close to the edge as possible, or sticking to known routes, not trying anything rigorous or new, and that there's levels of cave diving. But Mike also made a point to say that there's nothing really stopping a random, untrained person from grabbing some gear and going cave diving. Most parks will have someone checking certifications at the gate, but the biggest killer in cave diving is not having the training. Now, that's way less common today than it used to be, let's say, 10, 20 years ago, and the training should make you ready for it. If you're an obviously inexperienced diver attempting to go in, Cave divers will typically be at well-known dive sites and see you and likely call you out, which is probably where people say that cave divers can be abrasive and maybe gatekeeping. But at the same time, you can't close a mountain when somebody dies on a mountain, but you can close a cave because there's one opening. There have been a ton of caves, dry and underwater, where they've been closed because people that didn't know what they were doing died or got seriously injured. And on to the topic of cave closures as a result of deaths, Mike said that closing caves is the worst possible outcome for most of the fatalities. A lot of beautiful caves in Florida have gotten closed like that. By not following the rules, pre-allocated access rules, and systems in place for people that are qualified to be there, it's always a big loss for cavers and anyone trying to conserve caves because it takes away from the science that can be done there, the monitoring, and all of the caves in Florida are windows into the aquifer. So typically when a cave gets shut down, they block access for everybody. Landowners have an incentive to block access for cave divers because it's only a liability for them. However, not all closures are specific to deaths that occur in the area, and sometimes springs are closed in order to preserve the spring health. I also asked about a time where they were in a stressful situation while diving. They talked about a time when they were diving in a small tunnel where kicking up silt was inevitable and the visibility just kept getting worse. They said that it was really disorienting, but that it's nothing that a cave diving course wouldn't prepare you for. In fact, you run drills in a blindfold when you're diving so that you could get used to that kind of zero visibility and not freak out. On a normal dive, everything goes like clockwork. You get used to the conditions of the cave the more you dive. He also notes that there's no one thing that can kill you in cave diving. It's usually a cascade of things that lead to people dying. There's smart decision making too. Like if you have a gear failure, should you really continue the dive or should you go back? Maybe if you lose a light but you have 3 more, then it's okay. But if a tank regulator goes out, you better be making your way to the exit. At the end of the day, my friends describe themselves as tourists, recreational cave divers. You gotta recognize what you're in cave diving for. There are people pushing the limit every weekend going 400 feet. But right now, we have a lot of priorities. And where it's at is a hobby. We like to look at pretty caves. It's a really interesting thing we like to do. But we're not adding to any body of knowledge. It seems extreme to people who don't do it, but the type of diving we do, once you see what it is, you'll see it's adventurous, maybe something most people wouldn't do, but it's not crazy. You're not pushing the limits, you're not going into rooms no one has ever seen before. If you're the kind of person who wants to find new passages, new caves, go on expeditions to Mexico where you live in a cave for a month, that's a whole other group of people. And then it's like your only hobby, but also you kind of live and breathe for that. They don't do much else. It takes so much time, investment, money, that it's not worth it to most people, and most people can't. I asked about whether or not they thought the safety of cave diving improved as a result of progress in the technology that we use to dive. The proliferation of affordable dive computers that make decompression math something you don't think about anymore has helped a lot. It used to be that you had to consult tables and do math to predict how much time you'll be underwater, at what depths, how much air you have, and how much time you'll need to go back up. You really couldn't just go dive. But now with the advent of modern dive computers, you can go diving and all that math and everything is not something that you have to think about. You still learn that stuff in your certification, but it's so much more effortless now. I think the thing that keeps people alive today, more so than in the past, is the proliferation and formalization of standards and training. Most cave diving deaths before the 2000s were from non-trained divers that died because they had no formal training or equipment certified. Nor was there an agency that could tell you what you need at minimum for a cave dive. Now there's agencies with instructors and standards in cave diving. The most common deaths in Florida diving are heart attacks and pre-existing conditions, which is a good sign that, the caves themselves aren't the major problem. People aren't running out of air left and right and getting lost. That's become a lot less common thanks to standardized training. We also got into just how dangerous cave diving is and how that affects other parts of a cave diver's life. I asked them if they had trouble finding life insurance after reading in Jill Heinerth's book that cave divers, even at the recreational level, can't get it. And Natalie said that, yeah, they can't get life insurance. And for them specifically, it wasn't as much of a problem considering they don't currently have dependents, but what they've heard from their community and from others that do have families is that typically what somebody might do is take the money that they spend on their dives and match that into a fund for their family should they pass. And as a side note, to dive at all, you do need to get dive insurance, which is available from a few different businesses. People pushing the limits have a history of dying. One of the most famous explorers, Shaq Exley, died trying to break a depth record at 1,000 feet. Trying to break a record kind of predisposes you to death. And the DAN actually agrees with Mike here. In fact, if you are injured or die as a result of a record-breaking attempt, you are not covered by the dive insurance offered by the DAN. Thank you again to Mike and Natalie. While they have different experiences based on their gender, neither have said that they felt discouraged by their peers. I also decided to check out a few forums on scuba diving, caving, and diving, just to get more opinions out there. I wanted to know, what was it like to be a woman cave diving right now, to be a minority cave diving right now? And I got a few different answers. So I went on the R scuba, R caving, and R diving subreddits and asked the question, what is it like to be a woman or a non-binary person in cave diving? There were a few estimates thrown around by these cave divers about how many women they thought were in cave diving today. And they threw out percentages like 5 to 20%. That does seem on par with an article that somebody linked to me, saying that in technical diving there's about 16% women. For cavern and cave diving, not only does your equipment change, but you do need more courses in order to become certified. And I've heard of 3 specifically, one for cavern diving, the other for cave, and it's called like Cave 1, and then Cave 2, which is, I guess, the advanced version. I specifically asked these subreddits if women felt like they were encouraged by their peers to continue in the sport, and a lot of them said yes. In fact, most of them said that they felt encouraged by other women, and it was kind of a silent acknowledgement most of the time that they were in the minority and that they were sticking together, right? However, a lot of the women that responded also noted that they were older, let's say 30 and up, because younger people typically don't have the amount of money that it takes to become a cave diver. Not just a diver, but a cave diver. Something that surprised me was that while several of these women have gone diving in Florida, they mentioned Mexico as another premier dive spot where they found a lot of female dive instructors and divers. Now, I think that there has been a significant consideration made for women in the cave diving industry and the diving industry in general, but that's not to say that it's been 100% effective. An issue some women face is with the custom wetsuits and custom dry suits. For example, finding gloves that fit but that are also totally waterproof. Or, for example, in a dry suit, while men are able to unzip and pee in a dry suit without having to wear a diaper, women, or people with vaginas really, are not able to do the same thing. So there's something called a she-pee, which is a pink device to urinate from that you glue onto the dry suit. I want to say now that because there is still slow progress towards an equitable division of the genders in something like cave diving, the equipment, for example, the she-pee and like the pink stuff for women, it is very much locked into that traditional mindset of gender differences, right? But if we're being accurate, right, things like the she-pee are just for anyone that has a vagina, right? And if you thought the representation of women and people of color were incredibly small in cave diving, the LGBTQ representation is even smaller. There was a non-binary cave diver who responded, and they mentioned that Florida was not the most inviting place for them to go, and that they didn't actually go cave diving here at all, because it's not very inviting for many reasons. Meanwhile, in Mexico, they were actually very welcomed, and there were instructors who asked their pronouns before anything. So I also found that amazing that they were able to go to Mexico and feel more comfortable and also be taken care of. Several women noted that their cave diving buddies were their husbands, so that might affect the way that other men treated them because they were always with a man. So I did receive many responses here, but this is still a small sampling of cave divers in general. I also went on scubaboard.com, which is another online forum, but this time just about scuba diving, and I looked up cave diving posts specifically. And I found one about women in cave diving, and specifically about instructors, male instructors with women students. This instructor was asking if any other instructors had a disclaimer about the kinds of touches that people would be receiving in this class. If it's something like a cave diving class or a rescue class, they get very grabby. And obviously, like, if you don't want somebody to be grabbing you, especially in specific areas, they wanted their students to be able to speak up and say, like, hey, I know that this is a course where we do this, but if I have any adjustments on my body, like, I'll do them, right? Which seems very fair. Or there are instructors that were saying that they ask before every touch, right? It's just kind of like, instead of doing it at the beginning for everybody, it's more like, you know, can I adjust this, right? I think that that's fair. And something that this person noted, he said that as a male instructor, he thought it was very important to make sure that women felt comfortable in his presence and that they did not feel like they were being groped. Meanwhile, he would ask female instructors if they did the same thing, consent for touching, and they said no. That typically it's like, oh, but well, I'm a woman, so why would people feel uncomfortable? And that, yes, it's a double standard. And in my personal opinion, ask for everybody. I don't think that somebody who's uncomfortable with touch is suddenly going to be more comfortable because they're a different gender, the person touching. I just think that it's good practice if we talk about consent in a general sense. I also posted to Facebook group Scuba Women, and I asked them the same questions. I asked women if they felt encouraged within the sport. And something that I noted and that I really enjoyed about this group was that when I entered, they ask, are you a woman? And in parentheses, they say, or a non-binary person or a trans woman that feels like they would benefit from this group. That's very kind, really. And I think that the more inclusive that we are, the better. Many women felt very comfortable cave diving. And some would go, again, to Mexico, Playa del Carmen, Quintana Roo. And after exploring more posts on these issues, I actually found that another huge benefit of a group like Scuba Women is that women could go there to ask questions about being a solo traveler for these dive trips and whether the lodging was safe and comfortable. Now, older women 50 and up would post often in this group, and there was a woman who was cave diving since the 70s who decided to respond to me and talked about how she was on a panel from the National Speleological Society cave diving section about whether or not women should be allowed to cave dive. That's really wild. And she was on the panel with Shaq Axley. I don't know, it's just, history is not that far behind, right? History, and just, we need to kind of keep in mind that there are these big differences between generations and these gaps, these cultural gaps, really. I did notice that younger women that have been cave diving in the past decade, maybe the past 2 decades, will note that they feel very comfortable, that they do see other women, even if their women aren't the majority, but that they've never felt discouraged by their peers in cave diving. However, women who've been cave diving for much longer, let's say 3 decades, 4 decades, do note that not only were women the extreme minority in the early days and on, but they had received discouraging and disparaging comments from men, which is very sad. I feel like that, yeah, it's sad, right? But ultimately, I did see an evolution amongst these various groups of women who are scuba diving or cave diving specifically, where they do feel now that there are more women joining, there are more opportunities, it is more accessible in the sense that now you would find instructors, let's say, that are also women instead of all men. However, the inaccessible part of cave diving remains. It is definitely the cost, number one, and second would probably be the location. Something that I read over and over again in these responses was that you would be carrying over 100 pounds of gear on yourself, on your body, before dives, and that also is a limitation of, people that can do something like cave diving. It takes a lot, right? It's a toll on your body. It was after my conversation with them where I began to shift my perspective, because I realized that, yes, women are a minority in cave diving, but also people of color. They're very, very few. And one of those reasons may be cost. This is not necessarily an accessible sport. It's thousands of dollars, even just to begin. But lack of community as well as representation is also a huge factor in why there aren't more people of color in the sport. While you can find cheaper dive open water certification courses, at least in Florida, they can be from $325 to $900. But the lower end of that only includes the online course, and you do still need physical dives to complete your certification. So, some of these, let's say going toward the $900 end, will include the rental of equipment, the instructor on site, and your dives. But none of this includes traveling to the location, right? Or food, lodging if you don't live near the location where you're diving. There are costs that add up very, very quickly. Now, some equipment, of course, can be rented. However, there's equipment like mouthpieces, rebreathers that you don't want to rent, and that many scuba divers have said that you want to own that and know it best. You want your technology, your equipment to be fully functional and always maintained by you. I decided to look up organizations that helped Black people, people of color, and women get into scuba diving, and I found Diving with a Purpose and Black Girls Dive. These are both organizations that specifically help marginalized people who wouldn't have otherwise been able to begin scuba diving go on dive trips and learn more.
The Black Girls Dive Foundation is the brainchild of Nevada Winrow.
It's like my safe space. I just feel relaxed in water. My career, by training, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist.
Winrow combined her passion for diving and her love of science in a way that lifts up young Black women.
I think especially now with the world that we live in, I think diversity is a big thing.
Winrow says diving requires young Black women to rethink cultural practices and overcome a long history of racial exclusion.
So historically, Blacks were not allowed to go into swimming pools, and it created some type of fear. And that fear gets perpetuated from generation to generation.
The training culminates in a yearly dive trip in exotic places like the Bahamas. Along the way, the girls learn about ecosystems and water conservation.
The Diving with a Purpose dives typically are exploratory research dives. Many of their trips include Florida dives, and one of the most recent Diving with a Purpose trips was to the Guerrero shipwreck, which was a slave ship that sunk off the coast of Florida.
A living link to America's tortured past. Jay Hagler has seen it.
Combining the importance of history and ancestral memory and understanding how that applies today, combining those things with scuba diving, that was a match made in heaven.
Hagler is part of Diving with a Purpose, a group of primarily Black divers who love to go underwater, but also have a larger mission: to find and research sunken ships from the international slave trade.
The stories that we tell are important, and more importantly, the untold stories, because most people haven't heard the story, including myself.
Diving with a Purpose, or DWP, was founded in 2003 by divers Ken Stewart and Brenda Lansendorf to join an ongoing effort to find the remains of the Guerrero.
I found mention of Diving with a Purpose in this article from Adrian Jordan about scuba diving while Black and why getting into the sport of scuba diving is more challenging for people of color. Adrian came across the Underwater Adventure Seekers and the National Association of Black Scuba Divers as a part of her research. These are all efforts to build a community of Black divers and to encourage more in the future. Something that Jill Heinerth mentions in her book is called the DRD4R7 gene. And this gene is the one that she attributes to people that want to cave dive and explore and try new things and do things that maybe are really dangerous. Because this is like the thrill-seeking gene. It's found in people that have a higher tolerance for dopamine, so essentially they need more of it to feel the same way as somebody else. And the same people found with this gene were also more likely to be people with addiction, for example. And she also talks about specific examples where good friends of hers who were cave divers, who were researchers, also fell victim to addiction, and how the thing in your brain that makes you want to know more and do more can also be dangerous. So DRD4 is a dopamine receptor, and what 7R is a variant on that dopamine receptor. Two common variants are 7R and 4R. Now, 7R means 7 repeat allele. And I'm going to read some quotes here about what this gene is. So the dopamine receptor DRD4 is one of the most studied candidate genes for ADHD. The disorder has a heritability of about 76%. It is a precursor of behavioral problems in adolescence and adulthood, and among the dopamine-related genes investigated to date, this one, DRD4, has been widely studied and has the strongest association with ADHD in different meta-analysis studies. The variant is associated with hyperactivity and inattention. Dopamine in general relates to our executive functioning and our decision making, as well as our reward systems and motor functioning. And what studies have shown about people with this variant is that they have a propensity for greater risk taking, a heightened sensitivity to their environment, and they're at greater risk of attention and behavioral issues. For a lot of us, fear of the unknown holds us back from trying something new. It's a fear that comes from lack of control in an unpredictable situation. You'd be surprised to find that hobbyist cave divers exact many measures of control over their environment and safety. And there may be more traits that separate cave divers from people that don't practice extreme sports. I found a study examining the personality traits and the interpersonal relationships of cave divers. And the research is unique for several reasons, one of them being that an experienced cave diver actually did this research. It's important to note that it is correlational research, so it can't establish a cause within the study, just see if there's an association between variables. The study was also limited to men. The study describes how cave divers and those who participate in extreme sports have difficulties in their personal relationships, such as marriages and families, due to the amount of time and energy required to commit to cave diving. It requires proximity to an underwater cave, as well as expendable income and time for technical training and upkeep. The background of this study notes that previous research shows participants in extreme sports may exhibit addictive behavior towards their sport and feel a need more than a desire to be practicing their sport. So it's definitely something to think about. It interested me a lot because even though I'm not somebody that wants to go cave diving or that is a cave diver, it made me realize in myself that there are things that I push myself to do, right? Or that maybe other people wouldn't do. For example, somebody that likes roller coasters may have this gene too. Now, it's probably not just one gene, it's probably more than one, and a combination of nature, nurture. But it's very interesting that there is research supporting this. Now, when talking on these forums, I actually got a lot of names of female cave diving instructors and women who own dive shops, and I think that's really amazing. And I wanted to mention them here, so Jill Heinerth's name came up, of course, but also Natalie Gibb at Under the Jungle in Mexico, Christy Bernard at Country Cave Diving in High Springs, Florida, and the dive shop Extreme Exposure, also in High Springs, Florida. I also asked my friends what their favorite cave diving spot was, and they said it was the West Skiles Peacock Springs Park. Now, that one stood out to me because Jill Heinerth talks a lot about Wes Skiles in her book, and Wes Skiles is no longer with us, but he was also a cave diver, prolific explorer, and someone that Jill Heinerth worked closely with on several films, including in the Iceberg expedition. Now, when I dug a little deeper and asked who were the people that maybe made discouraging or disparaging comments to cave divers, more than a few of them said that inexperienced divers, or people that just didn't cave dive at all, were more often than not the ones saying the most discouraging things, or being like, that's crazy, why the hell would you do something like that? Which is kind of funny, right? It's like the people that know and understand the work involved were more encouraging than the people who had no clue about it. Kind of makes sense. This is one of those things where ignorance really does breed a lot of fear. And of course, all of the news and the videos about these cave diving disasters and deaths, or even the Thailand cave rescue, it makes us think like, why would anybody be in a cave, right? So, meanwhile, the people that were able to push past that kind of primal fear, that claustrophobia, and the fear of the unknown, they've encountered pretty amazing things. There are a bunch of people who say that cave divers just like to look at wet rocks, and that's kind of funny. Some of them embrace it. They're like, hell yeah. But the photos, the videos that I've seen of these underwater caves, these wet rocks, they look insane. Just absolutely insane. It is another world down there. You do see sea life animals that you wouldn't see on the surface, and it's just not something that you would have imagined for yourself. It's not really something that on land you get to experience, and unless you're an astronaut, you probably haven't had that same feeling, right? I took a trip to Peace Cave in Florida with a good friend of mine because I wanted to just do something related, right, to the topic, and understand a little better, right, what it might feel like, what caving is like, because again, as I know that I spoke to a few people and I got like second, third-hand experiences, but at the very least, I could try something like that as well. This is how that went. I went to Peace Cave and Dames Cave in the Withlacoochee State Forest here in Florida, and they're kind of big caves, more like beginner type, almost caverns with the Dames Caves, but Peace Cave was a lot smaller. Both of them had a lot of families in the area and more than a few people that were willing to help you if you had any questions on where to go or how to get somewhere. It was pretty nice. In the end, I was able to clear up a bunch of questions that I had and also lose that fear of the unknown little by little. It made me want to maybe try diving, get an open water certification, push myself a little bit with the things that I'm afraid of, because, I mean, even just sitting here and talking, you know, it scares me, right? I'm scared of criticism, right? Or like perception, but the only way to get over that is kind of through it, and this has been very helpful. I feel like I'm trying a lot of new things with the topics that I dive into. I've been able to talk to more people, I want to get more perspectives, and this was one where my initial thoughts, you know, scary, what the heck, cave diving, they flipped. Now it's like, if cave divers didn't exist, right, even recreational cave divers, because not everybody's an explorer, we would know significantly less about the planet. That's just a fact. You don't have to want to be the person in a cave, but I mean, at least there's no need to be a dick about it, right? Like, there certainly was a lot of apprehension and more than that, like, disgust at people that needed to be saved from an underwater cave or an above ground cave, because the idea is always like, why would you even do that? Why bother? Like, who cares? Nothing's in there. And I mean, like the underwater cave sign, like, there's nothing in here worth dying for. And that, I can see, I agree, it's like not worth dying for, right? However, that's still a measure that is different for everybody, right? What's not worth dying for? There are people who think Flamin' Hot Cheetos are worth dying for, right? I used to be one of those people. I can't eat them anymore. But you know what I'm saying? It's different. And people's tolerance of risk is totally different, right? And even amongst the cave divers that I spoke to, they would say that diving with another person, you have to assess like their risk profile. It's not, you can't just dive with a random person and expect to be safe. There's also this aspect of community culture where cave divers know and understand that they're not necessarily like people who have a hobby of jogging, right? It's not necessarily the same. They spend a lot more money, a lot more time, and do a lot more traveling, right? They also face a lot of scrutiny. So there's a kind of bond that happens in the caving community and the cave diving community. Now, with diving, I would say that I've seen stronger bonds in groups like scuba women, for example, and it's a lot bigger, right, of a hobby, of an activity that people do. It's more accessible, for sure. It's less expensive than cave diving and less scary for a lot of people. There have been a lot of technological advances in diving in general, and in cave diving. In fact, some of those technological advances were directly responsible for the rescue of those boys in the Thailand cave. And that's what I learned. I'm very happy that I was able to go from fear of the unknown to curiosity, right? Like a healthy curiosity. I think that we all should be a little more willing to dive into something and take our initial reactions with a grain of salt, maybe. But more than anything, I'm just really grateful with the amount of people that were willing to talk to me about their experiences, especially when it comes to being in a marginalized community. So if you want to support any of the organizations I mentioned, I will link them in the description. And thank you so much for watching. I had a lot of fun.